Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis. Today I'm joined again by Anarcho and Master Sanders and Logos to discuss biblical principles as applied to the state. Now, first things first, I think it's good to start with Romans 13. This sort of outlines what the state is supposed to do. Beginning with verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. So we see that the state is the divinely ordained institution to use the sword to maintain order in the world. And we'll get into this a little bit later on, but if you look at the Old Testament as well, one of the key purposes of the state is, I know it sounds a little trite, but to protect the little guy. The people that can't defend themselves or are disadvantaged, like widows, orphans, migrants, people that are living in your country but are not part of your ruling class or citizen class, and also to use the sword to execute people. So that's sort of the broad definition of the state. Now, I don't think it really matters necessarily what structure of the state is. I mean, I kind of go with Aristotle. There's roughly three ways you can parse it up, and they can be good or bad depending on the goals that the ruler is following. So in that sense, that's not a big deal. But I think one of the key things in beginning of the Old Testament and throughout the New is that the Bible teaches the state is not God. God is the lawgiver in the Bible, not a man, and no king or ruler is able to exercise authority over and above what God allows him to. So like in the ancient Near East and in antiquity, you have Egypt, Babylon, and Rome, where the rulers were gods or seen as chosen by the gods and had near limitless power and were totally unaccountable. And in modern times, we've seen this with people like Adolf Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, where they've attempted to deify the state. Whereas if you look at the Old Testament, specifically the prophets, it's hundreds and hundreds of years of people just calling the kings out for not performing justice. And so a very important principle is laid down here, the principle that power should be distributed and that there is a higher law than just the law of the state. So this also gives grounds for civil disobedience, where people can appeal to a higher law than the law of the state that's already enforcing it. So what are your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
I think you're absolutely correct, as when it comes to the idea of the state within Scripture. You know, in our modern age, we've sort of struggled to define what is the ultimate purpose of the state, whether it's the purpose is to protect the rights of individuals, or whether it's to protect the integrity of the nation state, or to more or less carry out the means of revolution, or what have you. But in terms of actual in terms of what Scripture says about it, we don't see anything that resembles liberalism or revolutionary progressive ideology. You know, we see something that's, one, the protection of the family. We see quite a bit, and also the way in which the poor and the least well-off in society do have recourse in a way that often gets missed in liberal societies, or a means that is sometimes trampled on or misinterpreted as in reactionary and revolutionary societies. So I think that with Scripture, I would agree with you that Scripture seems to offer a balanced approach to how we approach the worst off in our society compared to more modern systems of governance.
Exactly. So what are some of your thoughts on this opening framing of the nature of the state in Anarcho?
I want to go back to what you said, Todd, about Aristotle and the various forms of government, because the very important distinction between both systems is that in one, the state works for the good of all, whereas in one, it only works for essentially the ego, to put it bluntly. And the Christianity provides us the mechanism through which we can judge the state. You're correct when you say the state is not God, but God, and specifically his those following his ideology, can hold the state accountable and make it serve that eternal ethical truth, rather than the whims and the wishes of whether it be a material elite like an oligarchic few like we have now, or just the mob in a more democratic, and which is essentially the debate we have now in the Western world, is either the mob with social democracy or oligarchic few like what we have in the United States. And really, just at this point, just to have a polity like what you would see maybe in Switzerland, where the state truly serves the not just the group, but it serves an ethical, godly position that is heavily defined by a Christian back culture or background.
You brought up a good point, is this idea that the powers are separate. So while in the secular age, the religious roles in society are not seen as important, but in antiquity, they were extremely important. So like Julius Caesar was both head of the state and head of the church, Pontifex Maximus. So was Pharaoh, and so was the Babylonian kings. But throughout the Bible, the king is not to be the head religious leader. And the two examples where the king oversteps his boundaries, King Saul and Uzziah, they're both punished. Saul loses the kingdom and Uzziah is given leprosy. So we see this idea of spheres of jurisdiction. Okay, this is where you are, and it's circumscribed and defined rather than limitless like with Egypt. So what are some of your thoughts on that media mediator?
I mean, interesting way of starting to frame the conversation. I think I might have more to say about it as we start talking about specific issues and powers of the state more specifically.
Okay. Well, the number one power of the state is the power of the sword. And the state, this is where I think Weber is largely correct. I mean, you can always tweak the definition, but it's the monopoly user of force in a region. But more specifically, though, a state is the legitimate monopoly user. Because, for instance, Augustine in the City of God said that a pirate could do the same thing, rule over an area monopolistically. But that pirate wouldn't be a state. Only insofar as the state supports justice. And again, we'll get in more detail what justice is. But suffice it to say, the state is the institution that's divinely ordained to be the legitimate user of violence over a given geographic reason to implement justice. What are some of your thoughts, Master Sanders?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that particularly, but touch on something a little bit that Anarcho said, and we'll probably cover this a little bit later in the discussion. The biblical understanding of what is a state goes beyond just simply a neutral arbiter, right? We don't see within Scripture the idea of the state being a neutral arbiter that just that has no moral, but can't make any moral judgments outside of the protection of individual rights. Within the Scripture, we have this idea that whatever is justice, whoever gives authority to what institutions within society, they all have their root in God. So, ideally, I think we could all agree that I guess, for lack of a better word, a multipolar or multicentric society where you have separate jurisdictions for the state, for the state, for the church, etc., having checks and balances on each other, could only work and last in the long term as long as there's a uniform agreement where that authority comes from, as opposed to the tendency throughout history, which is to sort of centralize authority because power is the ultimate good rather than divine law. But not quite sure that's what you were getting at, Todd. But just to build on something that Anarcho started.
No, sure. So, Anarcho, what are your thoughts on the use of the sword as I defined it?
Sorry, I cut out for a sec there. Is the idea that the use of the sword is the main power of the state to command its populace through the use of physical threat?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think what legitimate, like I said before, the community, allied with the church is what sets the guidelines for what distinguishes, mere force. And this is where we, make fun of the libertarians for not being able to regard the social nature that the state plays. This is where the term, autistic libertarian comes from, is seeing the mere use of force the state exerts upon the citizenry without understanding the social character that takes on. And again, emphasizing the role that the church plays in crafting these guidelines, it provides the narrative we can use to judge how the state is serving everyone. And when the state does use the force to enrich certain factions, for instance, when we go from a polity where everyone votes for the benefit of all to a democracy where everyone votes for the benefit of their particular vying group. People say democracy is the rule of the majority. It's actually better to describe democracy as rule of the united minority. Then the point in that is saying that once the state goes down that route of using force to command the citizenry to the benefit of a minority, it's where we get the slippery slope to oligarchy and then tyranny. But the point being that yes, the state has the right of the sword, but it's only by a moral standard that we know that the sword is being used for justice rather than despotic purposes.
Exactly. Yeah. Anything you'd like to add to that, mediator?
I think this is an interesting topic. A couple points I'd like to pick up on are a thread we followed kind of from the last discussion about non-centralized power, and the thread we're picking up on here, which is the idea of the communal aspect of policing, the church, the local good for the polity as the local group. What's good for the local group as opposed to, say, centralized power. What I like to do, especially since people on the religious side of things, as you guys are often characterized as like, evil, bad, right-wing reactionaries, I like to pick up on points where you actually have a thread of agreement with the left where you could come together on and discuss things and actually, build allies and coalitions. One thing the left seems to have been asking for quite a bit lately in response to like police brutality and all the rest of it is community-centric policing, where the people who police a community are more likely to live in that community. And they are therefore going to want to pursue the good in that community. They're going to have relationships to local community leaders, churches, organizations. So they're not just going out and, say, catching some random teenager on the street. It's actually a teenager they know somebody who knows this teenager. They know what their life is going through, and they don't just beat them with a club or something and say, bad, quit committing crimes. They actually say, hey, I've heard from such and such your life is on a bad path. Let's get you into a counseling program. Let's get you into a mentoring program. Let's do something above and beyond for the good, as opposed to just chastising out evil or something to that effect. And I think there's actually some set of agreement that can be picked up on here. As far as the monopoly on force aspect, something that resonates me with the state and something I like to troll libertarians with myself is in Plato's Republic, when Plato is talking about how the state comes to be formed. And Plato starts off by saying, well, people have different skills. They're not great at everything. And so they have to come together to trade. You build pottery, you catch fish, you hunt wildlife, you defend us, from barbarians and invaders, whatever. And eventually a market forms around this. But, you have to make sure that people play by the rules. No stealing, lying, cheating, anything else. There's going to be some central security apparatus around the market. And Plato's like, oh, look, golly gee, that's basically the formation of the state. And so when the anarcho-capitalist is like, yeah, we just want the pure market and we want all the securities, it's like, well, yeah, that's a state by the Platonic definition, certainly. So, back to the most primitive definition I've seen and agreed with, the monopoly on force is definitely good. Now, you might not believe it's to protect the market because markets are immoral, and you're defining more of a religious tradition. But I think there's an analog there. There's enough of a basic first principles approach that there's enough overlap you can make use of it.
Yeah. Now, this next topic is one that you brought up last time, and in sort of is the inspiration for today's episode, is taxation. Now, when Moses was given the law, there was really no state in Israel. I mean, to be honest, there wasn't even really a state until King Saul. And even then, it didn't really become a solidified institution until King David. So taxation, in the sense that you and I would recognize it, didn't really exist until at least King Saul. But there's two principles that I think we can deduce from this in order to make a more just tax code. One is the principle of equity, which is Exodus 30:15, which states that both rich and poor should pay exactly the same amount for the atonement price, and also the tithe, 10% of your income, right? If God only asks for 10%, what right does the state to have to ask for more? And so two things are happening here with the principle of equity and, say, a flat tax of 10%. Is you streamline the tax code, you have fewer tax dodgers, which means you could have a smaller bureaucracy that's more efficient. And so I think we can, by applying these principles, we can have a more streamlined and just tax system. So, Master Sanders, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I remember Ben Carson actually said something quite similar in his, I may have been even before his presidential campaign, which was, if God only asked for 10%, like how much less should the state? I've kind of gone back and forth myself as to whether or not a flat tax or a national sales tax would be more efficient in collecting revenue and being fair. But I would say that regardless, when it comes to a biblical model, the flat tax offered by Scripture, more or less, is quite fair. And not only to that respect, that there's no respecter of persons. There's all in terms of what percentage you pay, but there's also guaranteed revenue as well. So I've always, I don't know, for many people on the left that are, I found quite hypocritical, is that they'll call for greater taxation on the left, on the rich, and call for fewer loopholes, which, in theory, I would agree to a certain extent, but creating a flat tax would be a far more equitable, far more fair way of not just taxing people on the same level, but also in collecting revenue. So I think whether or not, and going back also to this idea of the 10%, and why the state should not ask, I would argue that the state shouldn't ask for more than 10%, is that not only is it a payable taxation by all people concerned, it's also a recognition that the state is not God. That why should the state ask for more than what God asks for? So keeping the state perhaps, having enough steady revenue, but yet not having it to a certain insane degree where they genuinely affect people's lives by the rate of taxation, I think is something, in theory, you would hope people on the right and the left would be able to get behind. But I'm not as optimistic on that front as some may be.
There's another point that you made me think of as well, that this principle of equity on taxation would do. It would limit the growth of the size of the state. So the left is concerned about the imperial warfare state going around conquering other nations, and then the political right is more concerned about domestic tyranny at home. But either way, restricting the revenue stream of the government in such a way would reduce both threats of government, which in principle you would think the right and the left should be able to get behind on a sort of a joint venture. What are some of your thoughts on this, Anarcho?
So, as I stated in the last podcast, a 10% flat tax definitely has a lot of advantages. Though me personally, as a Georgist, I'm more of a fan of the land tax. But in both instances, you would have much more simplification and much less state intervention, as both you and Master Sanders pointed out. And I think an advantage both would have as well is a great amount of subsidiarization. Logos pointed out the advantages of local governance, particularly with regards to community policing. I think that we could go through a whole laundry list of public services, and I think almost all of them would be done better locally. I think centralized states only have the advantage of sort of maintaining regular commerce, like basically free trade between the various counties, which makes sense for practical purposes. But I would say in social regulation, you want most of it to be done at the locality because it's easier. You would have more, especially if we allowed for restrictive covenants, which can be in a whole conversation in and of itself. We could have people with free association choose to form communities where their local governance can enforce particular social regulations to maintain the cohesion necessary to keep what I was talking about before with respect towards a polity rather than a democracy. And once a tax system that's more simplified, either whether it be a 10% flat tax or a land tax, with its consistency would allow it would make it easier for the wealthy to bundle up in a locality where their taxes go towards the best of public services, and there's a heavy amount of regulation, where particularly with economic regulation, we're talking about wealthy localities versus poor communities, which might be a little more lax in that area and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are some of your thoughts on this media mediator?
From the economic perspective, one of the things we worry about with the flat tax is if it's defined before or after living expenses. You know, what does it take into account? So the problem with why we call the increasing tax a progressive tax, and the other thing the flat tax, you know, why we consider those is it's an economic fact that, you know, poor people spend a larger proportion of their income just on their living expenses. We have tons of macroeconomic literature that says the propensity to consume is far higher the lower the money you make. The propensity to be able to save is higher given the more money that you make, because just like a business, a person has fixed costs. They have to pay rent or a mortgage or something for a house. They have to pay for their food. They have to pay for their clothing, whatever. And so you pay enough money to meet those things, and then everything above and beyond is gravy. Everything else is kind of like a luxury or an optional good you can buy. And eventually you make thresholds of money such that even after buying some of the luxuries you want, you still have tons of money you don't know what to do with. Now, if you just tax everybody 10%, say, without taking into effect somebody's expenses, then what you could have is you could have people, let's say they have to pay, I don't know, 80% of their income on fixed expenses, just to some contingent part of the market. And then you charge them extra 10%. So if they only get to keep 20% after, you know, paying their bare costs of living, and you charge them 10, you're effectively charging them 50% of their discretionary income, versus if somebody else makes enough money they can keep 80%, you're charging them like 1/8 of their discretionary income, right? So that's one of the big fears that economists have when they think about taxation. Now, what you could do is you could define a flat tax based on how much you pay after you've paid your necessary expenses, rent, cost of living, something. And so the trick with that, though, is how much of what you're buying in groceries is luxury versus needed goods, or how much are you buying like a luxurious apartment, or are you buying like a cheap one? So you'd have to have economists come up with some kind of an index, like what would be a reasonable amount of fixed cost that the average person would expect to pay, deduct that from your incomes, and then tax on the difference, or something similar to that effect. So that's one of the big things about taxation. The other question is, so the second part I'd like to point out is this idea that taxation could limit the government. I think the other pillar you'd have to make that work is the government can't run on deficit spending, or it can only run on deficit spending for such and such amount of time, because our government for quite some time now has been accruing deficits, and now we have a $20 trillion national debt. So just because we restrict the income source of the government doesn't mean it's necessarily going to lower its spending. It might just go into more debt if we're not careful. So we have to. The taxation alone won't do it. We'd have to correspond that with other restrictions on government, the ability it has to spend money. And then I think that you're right. And I think one thing the left should be able to get behind is the lack of foreign intervention. Now they'd want the social programs, but I think a lot of this hinges on the right's ability to argue that can be better be done locally. I think if the right can succeed in making that argument, the left will have no argument. So that's going to be the main pillar of the discussion going forward on that aspect, I think.
So, okay, but how about as the general principle, though, taxation should be based on the principle of equity, that it's equally, the rules are equally applied to all the subjects?
Yeah. I mean that's the idea, right? And so it depends on what the rule is. So, for example, is the rule 20% of all your income over and above what you need to pay your cost of living? What's the rule? Whatever the rule is, applied evenly to everybody. That's exactly right. And so the question is, if you increase the percent you pay in taxes based on your income, is that applying the rule equally because of the differential in discretionary income versus fixed costs, or is it unfair? Is it unfair? Are you taxing them more because they have more money? So the central question, which economists argue about until the end of time, is what does it mean to apply the rule equally from a mathematical perspective?
Yeah. Uh, in the comments, Dean Campos had a funny joke, and it goes back to it's related to our discussion of the tax. He says, he said, reminds me of a joke I heard. A powerful king once asked the wise man, "Since you're so wise, how much am I worth?" After some careful consideration, the wise man replied, 29 pieces of silver. The king responded in surprise, "Only 29?" To which the wise man replied, "After all, Christ was worth 30 pieces of silver. Or do you consider yourself of more value than Christ?" And that's just a humorous way to sort of make the point that we said that the government shouldn't be asking for more than 10% of what we take in. Now, one of the things that I know you wanted to get at, Master Sanders, is that the government's primary application principle, the taking of human life, the use of the sword, often termed the lex talionis, is often widely misunderstood. So maybe you could start by explaining some of that.
Yes. I've heard many Christians as well as liberals sort of had this misconception of what is lex talionis, or sometimes summarized as eye for eye. Now, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, is often cited as a negation of eye for eye. But I think it should be understood as what Jesus was getting at in the Sermon on the Mount. That Jesus was talking more about the personal application of eye for eye rather than the application of the law. And many people would take the application of law and use that to apply it to personal vendettas. Now, when it comes to actual lex talionis, we see the idea that the punishment meets the crime, and not only that, it's regardless of who commits it. So many people, one of the earliest law codes that we have is, of course, the Law Code of Hammurabi. The problem is, by modern standards, is that it's quite unfair. It's crime is punished, but the punishment of the crime is usually tailored to the person who commits it, right? So if someone were to steal, let's say, a melon from a vendor, if the person were of an aristocratic origin, the fine would be, or the punishment, sorry, would be far less than that of, let's say, a peasant, who would pay far more for the same crime. The Bible does not, at least within the Torah, does not give any distinction between rich and poor, except for maybe exceptions that would help the poor in fulfilling certain religious obligations. But nevertheless, we see within Scripture equity across the board for both rich and poor. Also, in contrary to elements of Catholic social teaching, we also don't see within the Torah an idea of a deference toward the poor, or the poor getting preference. In fact, the Bible restricts it. It restricts the application of justice. Always restricts preference to both the rich and poor. So both are equitable to this, or subject to the same law.
Yeah, exactly. The verse you were using is in Exodus 23, verse 3. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. But so Narco, what are some of your thoughts on lex talionis?
I'm not actually sure I have much to add to this specific topic. I'll stay silent.
All right. Mediator.
Sorry, I lost the plot. We're talking about the eye for an eye thing, right?
Yeah, capital punishment.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. I think that's really tough. I think the state obviously has the authority to met out punishment for the safety of the community and whatnot. But Where where capital punishment falls on that, I have no idea, especially due to the fact that, we don't always know if the person being tried is absolutely guilty of what they're being tried for. If the state kills a wrong person, that makes the state a murderer. That sort of thing. There's so many complexities. I don't know if there's a good first principled way to address the problem. I think ultimately it might have to come down to like pragmatism or something after the fact.
Yeah. Okay. I think basically one application could be in 1 Corinthians 10:23, where Paul says that all things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient. So I think what we can agree on is that the state has the right to execute someone, but given some of your concerns, Logos, it may not be prudent or expedient to execute that person.
Right.
I think you can agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, the next thing, and this is one of the most distinctive elements of what the Bible has to say about the state, is what is it supposed to use the force for? Among other things, one thing is protecting the people that can't protect themselves. Widows and orphans, aliens and strangers. Now, there really weren't immigrants in the ancient world, but there were people that lived in Israel that did not worship Israel's gods, but lived in the land. Some of them were the Canaanites that survived. Others were newcomers like the Philistines. And then there were those that would travel through, maybe as merchants or whatnot. And we see again that this principle of equity, that the laws, like Exodus 12:49, there's one law for the native and for the stranger and the alien. So we see that these people are to be treated with the same respect as a fellow Hebrew. So if there's a criminal case, you don't privilege the Hebrew. Whereas, all throughout the world with tribalism, it's my tribe is always presumed to be innocent and the other tribe is presumed to be guilty before any of the evidence has been looked into. But see, God gives us a definition of no, you don't do that. It's a blank, justice is blind. So neither one can be privileged one way or the other. You just have to look at the evidence available. And so often throughout Scripture, kings and prophets either condemned others for perverting justice, and perverting justice most of the time deals with oppressing the poor, primarily widows and orphans, and the stranger and the alien. And see, what do these four groups have in common? They have no advocate. These people have no power to draw on. They have no organization. And in many ways, the judge of the judges, and then the judge in a more generic sense in a law court in Israel, and then later the king, was supposed to be their advocate, the one who could, through the centralized power of the state, step in on their behalf and redress the grievances. And this is really kind of incredible because in the ancient world, widows and orphans, they were crap. Nobody cared about them at all. There's an interesting book, The Orphans of Byzantium, Child Welfare in the Christian Empire by Timothy S. Miller. He opens up by discussing Greece and Rome and how they treated orphans. As far as we know from the Greeks, the primary instance of orphan care was in Athens, where they would take care of the orphans and widows of soldiers who died for the state. But that was about it. And the Romans didn't really have, what I can tell, an official organization of poor relief. Usually, it would be like the paterfamilias who would take care of his own. But if you just, were an outcast and had no one to take care of you, just tough noogies, I guess. The other thing is, in the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was the firstborn and the one who was born of a known paternity where the parents were still alive, who was considered privileged by the gods. The one that got all the attention, all the glory. Whereas in the Old Testament, it's the other way around. It's the poor, the fatherless, and the widows that have the protection and God's compassion. And we even see this with the upturning of firstborn birthrights, Jacob and Esau, Ephraim and Manasseh. We see how God chooses the younger to usurp the elder. And so there's this different focus, this focus on the younger, the weaker, the vulnerable, in a way that we don't see in Greece and Rome, at least until the Christian era with Constantine and beyond. You see, people just take this for granted. Taking care of poor and weak people is not human nature. And we've inherited this Jewish Christian tradition that's been over 3 millennia in the making. And all too often, I think people on the left take this for granted. And we're beginning to see now that with that cultural view receding, those people on the margins are taking it on the chin. What are some of your thoughts, Master Sanders?
Well, I mean, some that might suggest that that's not happening yet. I would just contend, well, look what's happening with abortion. Look what's happening with euthanasia. Is that we're seeing that we're beginning to see bits of it now. That discarding traditional Christian morality, we're seeing people on the fringes get more and more of a raw deal, and it's not just in social issues. It's the way the corporations are run as well. Things that people can be just laid off for the benefit of the corporation with no real recourse. So you're right. Humanism does take it for granted that these things are natural to human nature. The problem is that humanism and most of these other more modern leftist ideologies just take for granted what Christianity pioneered.
Yes. One other interesting passage that deals with this is Ezekiel 16:49, where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed not because of the sin of sodomy, but because they ignored the poor. Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. So again, we see this inversion of how natural humans behave and how they organize governments. What are some of your thoughts, Anarcho?
Well, I just want to expand on Sanders' last point that not only does humanism take for granted what Christianity pioneered, but it can't even recapture some of the more subtle necessities that Christianity brings. For instance, the idea. So the state is supposed to be a champion of aliens and foreigners, but the left has skewed this, particularly more liberal versions of Christianity skew this to say that open borders is a Christian virtue. That's just not, especially with the refugee case. And not only does this, first of all, this defies demographic trends that show that the more Christian nations tend to be the most resistant. Poland and Hungary, which have much greater commitment to their Christian roots, are much more resistant to open borders policies than more secular nations like the UK and Germany. And the humanism as a governing ideology just has no real plan because it holds humanity as its highest goal. It can't establish because humans can be arrogant, they can be wrathful, they can be greedy, they can be envious. These are not the principles you want. This is not the standard you want to use when advancing forth a state that's supposed to work for everyone and not just the basic ego of mankind. So, we see with open borders, they're trying to get back some of that altruism. It's not working for everyone, but what they don't realize is that they're sacrificing, their very nation state to try to make that work, and it won't even work anyway. But anyways, I've said my piece here.
Yeah, I would agree. The left often likes to hijack this principle. This isn't a principle of how you regulate your borders, but it's rather a description of a principle of how you deal with people already within your borders that meet those criteria. What are some of your thoughts, Media Mediator?
Yeah, so this is interesting. Sorry, my headset was weird. This is interesting. This actually intersects with a whole lot of points that we've been discussing earlier as well. So the state caring for the downtrodden and the weak, the orphans, the sick, making sure that the law arbitrates fairly. This kind of ties back to the first discussion we had about what to do with, say, tax breaks, in our first post. So we didn't quite get to touch on it with taxes because we hadn't got to this point yet. If taxes are just for like basic infrastructure, state defense, and everything else, then and the state's just taking the basic amount it needs to maintain itself and make sure the citizenry are safe and can act in the state, then tax cuts, in my view, don't make sense. If the state's taking what it needs and nothing more just to maintain itself, then where does it have room in the budget to tax cut anybody for any reason? But if we're adding on some extra things from the purview of the state, like looking out for orphans, making sure the poor have a fair shake, a robust justice system, and lots of other interesting ideas put forth here, then it might make sense. So, for example, if there's an upstanding member of the community that, I don't know, builds roads or hospitals or donates money to certain causes or something like that, and does well within the sphere of its community to provide lots of infrastructure for the people, well, then certain things that the state would want to do, like care for orphans or things like that, that's being provided in some degree by this private organization, and then it might make sense to cut this portion of their taxes based on what the state would allocate from them toward these issues, because they're helping in their own way make sense of or deal with some of these problems. So I think when you bring this dimension into it, you can then start talking about the more complicated things in taxation, like tax cuts. That's the first thing. The other thing I want to note as well is there was a brief comment made about humanism. I've been seeing a bunch of memes on my Facebook page lately by atheists saying things like, while you sit there with your thoughts and prayers, I'm going to take my kid to the hospital or whatever. And I just think to myself, I'm like, don't you idiots realize the Christians pioneered the first hospitals? Like, what are you doing? It's not like Christians don't believe in hospitals. Where's this coming from? So, from our conversations, Todd, and from others, Christianity has this tradition of building institutions within institutions, such as the state, such as hospitals and things like that, to care for things like that. So this also goes back to the Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty conversation, where Matt Dillahunty is just like, well, yeah, we can just presuppose these good qualities like pain and pleasure or well-being or whatever. And it's just like, no, you can't. You can't posit that outside of this context. We used to live in societies without hospitals. We used to live in selfish hunter-gatherer tribal societies. We had to build these things slowly over time. And a lot of atheists, I find, just want to take this for granted and say, well, duh. Well, it's like, yeah, everything's duh after you've been shown how to do it. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, that part got tangled. It's been weighing on my mind lately, how easy people just cast away these things and take them for granted and then want to divorce them from their source material. It's like, no, you can't just do that. Not easily you can't. So I don't know. I guess that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, it's like trying to remove the first story from a skyscraper and see what's left over. But one other thing that we see is a strong condemnation of centralized power in the government in 1 Samuel 8, where the prophet Samuel warns Israel about how a tyrannical ruler will abuse them. And we see a concrete example of this in 1 Kings 21, when Ahab kills Naboth to steal his vineyard. And what we see here is that the government can steal. You get this view from socialists. They almost seem to think the government can't steal. The government seems to have a legitimate claim on whatever it wants. It can just take this and take that, and there's no repercussions. Well, it can't. That's not a biblical principle. The government just can't take whatever it wants. Whether that's eminent domain, kicking somebody off their property for a big corporation or a railroad, or whether it's, something, which is clearly a power grab. But even other power grabs that the left is less inclined to look at, say welfare and taking from, robbing from Peter to pay Paul, that would also fall under that judgment. And really, this gets to that classic libertarian line. Any state powerful enough to take from the rich and give to you is powerful enough to take everything you've got. And there does seem to be this element within the biblical narrative of the dangers of centralized power in the state. What are some of your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
Well, one thing that does grate on me when I hear from, especially when I hear it from Christian libertarians, is the idea of when they parrot the libertarian phrase, taxation is theft, which is not necessarily true. I mean, we see Jesus literally telling his followers, pay your taxes and, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But there is a line where the state does overstep its bounds, where the state does require more than its due. For example, Christians would not, as a whole, argue that the state is owed something. Like we, as you read from Romans 13, is that Christians are required to obey the law, at least when it to the point where it doesn't contrast with biblical law or what have you. But there is a moment where the state can cross that boundary of what is right and lawful for it. The thing is, we need to understand, however, is that the only way we could really have a guaranteed way of checking the state when it does, or at least a higher authority than the state to appeal to when the state does cross its given authority, would be a greater agreement as to greater truth, which is that of Christianity, that of Scripture, etc. So
exactly. Anarcho.
Right, I think this is one of the idea of subsidiarization that the local unit has. That as much power has to be restored to the local unit as possible is key when talking about Logos brought up policemen, and I think also welfare would be the other main one when it comes to local politics. When the modern centralized welfare state is the bureaucracy is very hard to hold accountable. There's a lot riding on in the short term people who need whether it be SNAP or food stamps, or Medicaid, the very quick availability of federal services. If it were allowed to be localized, this accountability, first off, it would be much more of a contract between the users and the people who would use these services and the people providing them. There's a sort of quid pro quo of, we will keep you on your feet for a short term, but we're also going to be very stern about you being diligent about looking for new work and not allowing this to let you fall into sloth, especially in, again, a community government where the church was a very strong cultural force. This would come naturally, and this would also be a main tool to weed out any sort of political corruption. In fact, given the sort of technological and material change we're going in, it would be since labor is not nearly as required as it was in the past, we might be getting to the point where a sort of the reason Athens could afford to be a direct democracy was mainly due to slaves, and arguably due to other various groups being denied the franchise. But since we've largely mechanized a lot of our work, we might be coming to the point where the average person could have a significant amount of leisure time that they might have a great deal of time left to engage in political debate. And if we were to localize our politics, it could open up a large amount of opportunity for the masses to be able to take back the system without going to the central level, where we end up getting more democracy, whereas at the local level it tends to be more a polity.
Yeah. Media mediator.
I think Anarcho made a really good point. I guess in the context of the other 2 points, the other 2 speakers, I lost the general topic. What was the topic we're making points on in general?
I think I kind of got lost too.
I thought it was you were mentioning centralization and the fact that the state can overstep its bounds.
Oh yeah, theft. The state can steal.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
I remember hearing somebody mention taxation as theft, and I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. And then somebody was talking about non-central governments. I'm like, yeah, that's a good point too. And then I lost the thread. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, which is why I've been trying to come back to this whole thing and link it together, right? What does the state do? What is the role of taxation? Or should we use tax reductions as some sort of incentive for goods? At the local level, we probably could. Yeah, I'm trying to tie these threads all together. That this is definitely right. And I do think we have to make sure that the state isn't overstepping its bounds and weighing against one member of the population. I think Anarcho made a really, really good point as well about automation and jobs. A lot of people say something like, we're replacing jobs with automation, but we're getting jobs back. Like a lot of people on the right like to say this. But if you look at a lot of new jobs coming back, it's like, it's like a lot of Uber. It's like a lot of administrative work. It's like a lot of commentators. We're seeing people that would, go into the workforce. They're being Twitch gamers. They're being political commentators on YouTube. We have this ballooning idea of commentary, and I think that it's right. We could start taking advantage of that instead of having like commentary on centralized like European politics. What if you had people commenting purely on local politics? And so instead of having like a Sargon or something talking about like European or UK politics, suppose each member of UK had its own Sargon talking about their own local politics. I mean, if that became relevant enough, if local politics became relevant enough that you could have commentators, I mean, that would be huge job growth. There'd be a huge demand for local people to see people talking about their local issues and everything else. I think that's a great way to emphasize this point about the idea that automation doesn't have to lead to job loss. If we can make the local more meaningful, I think that's a good connection.
Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end of the conversation, so we'll start with you, Master Sanders. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I think that ultimately, when it comes back to the purpose of Scripture, we see that Scripture is good, profitable for doctrine, for training, for reproof, for correction, and instruction in righteousness, as Paul writes in 2 Timothy. But Scripture is just more than just a personal, life guide. It's more than just a handbook on how to live. There's quite a bit of within Scripture that can be extrapolated to how we understand governance, how we understand economics. And while we may debate as to the appropriateness of that even within Christian circles, I think we can agree that the scriptural alternatives compared to modern day political ideologies, I think are far more satisfying to the concerns that we have regarding fairness, regarding what is just, regarding the plight of those who are less opportune, as well as the respect of property rights, and as well as the respect of individual and communal well-being. I think our society would definitely benefit from studying Scripture as a guidebook to politics as well as personal living.
Okay, Anarcho, final thoughts.
The state has many important social functions, but ultimately it comes down to the cultural background and particularly the religious background of the community as to whether the citizenry can hold the state accountable and maintain social cohesion and provide for the weakest among us with a law system and various other public goods.
Okay. Final thoughts, media mediator.
I think this has been an interesting conversation. I mean, it's hard for me to understand exactly where everybody's coming from, not myself being a Christian or well-versed in biblical literature. But I do think in the way that this topic is being presented now is very contrast to the way in which it's presented in national politics. And I think that if we follow this thread and have a consistent way of representing this in a way that both the left, the right, people can broadly agree with, my hope is that ultimately we can find consensus on these topics in an age of increasing political polarization. So I'm very hopeful these topics will continue to bear some kind of fruit.
Yeah, okay. So I think a good place to end is this Augustine's account of Alexander and the Pirate, which comes from Book 4, Chapter 4 of the City of God. Justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? The band itself is made up of men. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by the pact of the confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed on. If by the admittance of abandoned men this evil increases to such a degree that it holds places, fixed abodes, takes possession of cities, and subdues peoples, it assumes the more plainly the name of a kingdom, because the reality is now manifestly conferred on it, not by the removal of covetousness, but by the addition of importunity. Indeed, that was an apt and true reply which Alexander the Great was given to Alexander the Great by a pirate who he had seized. For when that king had asked the man what he meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, he answered with bold pride, "What thou meanest by seizing the whole earth. Because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, whilst thou who dost with a great fleet art styled an emperor." This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.